James Harden is one of the most polarizing players in NBA history. From his fashion sense to his play style, everything about him is unorthodox. The most unorthodox aspect to him is how he goes about making his career decisions. Every time he's had a desire for a change of scenery, it's been nothing short of a fiasco. He's had public disputes with management, called people out, and intentionally destroyed his body in efforts of getting what he wanted. It's something that we quite frankly have never seen in the modern era of the NBA. So today, we'll be going through each of the infamous James Harden trade requests, look at how each situation got as toxic as it did, examine the final results, and look at what we might be able to expect regarding his trade demand from Philly. So buckle up for a story that includes lies, deception, penny pinching, and more. James Harden learned how brutal the business side of basketball can be very early on in his career. After clearly showing the signs of being a franchise cornerstone during his first 3 years in Oklahoma City, the Beard was looking for a max deal from the Thunder after winning the Sixth Man of the Year and helping lead his team all the way to the finals. Despite clearly being overqualified for the role, Harden had no problem sacrificing and coming off the bench for the good of the team. Because of this, he wanted to be compensated with a max contract. Unfortunately for OKC, they were financially strapped at the time, and it would have to dig deep into the luxury tax to give Harden what he wanted. After months of back and forth with management, Harden made it clear that if OKC wasn't going to give him the max that was available, he would be turning down any counteroffer they made and sign with another team for more money in free agency. That's what was ironic. Despite knowing that signing with another team would result in much more money, James wanted to stay with the Thunder as long as he was treated like he was on the same level of KD and Russ. Thunder GM Sam Presti never budged and made a final offer of 4 years, $54 million, $6 million short of the max. Almost immediately after turning it down, Harden was then traded to the Houston Rockets, where he signed a 5-year, $80 million deal and began his time as a superstar. On the surface, there was nothing really wrong with his trade request. Nobody can blame him for handling this behind the scenes and ultimately leaving to get $26 million more in guaranteed money, especially after sacrificing the way he did. But this did show us early on in his career that Harden had no problem leaving any situation, no matter how good it was on paper, which serves as a good foreshadowing for some later points in this video. Fast forward about 8 years, and James Harden has cemented himself as one of the greatest players of his generation. Despite multiple scoring titles and conference finals runs, Harden and the Rockets could never quite get over the hump and win a championship. They ran through just about all of their assets and tried everything they could in terms of roster construction, and after their small ball lineup was convincingly beaten by the Lakers in the 2020 playoffs, the organization saw enough and looked like they wanted to rebuild from the top down. It all started with Mike D'Antoni, the architect of the system that led to James Harden breaking so many records, leaving the Rockets on September 13th, 2020. After being eliminated from the playoffs, Harden still spoke positively of his coach and expressed that he wanted him to stay. This was the first red flag. About a month later, Daryl Morey stepped down as the general manager of the team, which really made it feel like the Rockets were losing their identity. From there, the next domino to fall was Russell Westbrook, as he then requested to be moved from Houston. When this was originally reported, it seemed like the Rockets were just going to try and flip Westbrook for someone else to try and be James Harden's co-star, as he indicated that he had no desire to be traded despite Westbrook's request. I'm not sure exactly what happened during that short time period after Russ requested his trade, but Harden then switched gears and formally requested one himself. But unlike OKC, it wasn't about the money. We know that because after making his trade request, the Houston front office tried to offer him an extension that would make him the first player in NBA history to be paid $50 million a year, but it was shockingly declined. He not only declined, but he let management know that the only place he wanted to be moved to was Brooklyn. This is where it got really out of control. After passing up on the extension, the Rockets did their best to try and create a formidable team around Harden. They traded Westbrook for John Wall, who Harden reportedly preferred to play with. They also brought in DeMarcus Cousins and Christian Wood to see if that would be enough to convince him to stay. Unsurprisingly, this didn't really move the needle for him. Houston stated that despite the trade request, they were in no rush to move their franchise cornerstone, and James Harden was not happy about that, to say the least. It initially started with Harden holding out and not reporting to training camp on December 3rd. Despite not showing up on the mandatory date, he informed the front office that he would be there soon, which is absolutely crazy. Could you imagine missing multiple days of work or school and then just telling your boss or teachers that you're basically going to show up whenever you feel like it? If that wasn't bad enough, he was seen in a Las Vegas nightclub and then was seen partying with Lil Baby to celebrate the rapper's birthday, giving him $300,000 in cash to celebrate. I felt like this always showed that Harden had more money than he could ever need, and no amount would be able to convince him to stay in Houston. All of this came during the peak of COVID, where the NBA had strict policies that the Beard was breaking left and right. Out of nowhere, he decided to show up on training camp on December 8th, and actually suited up for preseason. The first thing that people noticed when he came back was that he was a good 15 to 20 pounds overweight compared to a few years earlier. Despite that, he came into the season firing, as he scored 44 points in his first regular season game, pretty much picking up where he left off the season prior. After another couple of games showing the world, specifically Brooklyn, that he could still play at an MVP level despite clearly not being in shape, his level of production dropped off a cliff, as he was completely checked out and just on cruise control. After dropping to 3-6 following back-to-back losses to the Lakers, he finally snapped, telling reporters that it was clear that this team just was not good enough, and that he gave everything he had to the city, but didn't think the situation was something that could be fixed. While we were already able to tell that he had no desire of being in Houston anymore, this made it abundantly clear, and made it a super awkward situation for him and his teammates. But it seemed to work, as he was traded to the Nets just a day later to form one of the greatest super teams of all time. This whole situation set an awful precedent that Harden would go on to use in the future. Once he realized he didn't want to be there anymore, James Harden pretty much started moving like Peter from Office Space, as he completely stopped caring on and off the floor. And as a result, he was traded to the exact team of his choosing. I'm not saying he shouldn't have demanded out, because that Rockets team got really bad really fast, but to act the way he did then get rewarded for it only meant it would get crazier from here. Moving on to early 2022, the Brooklyn experience hasn't quite been what Harden expected. They were heavy championship favorites heading into the 2021 playoffs, and probably would have won it if they stayed healthy, but injuries to both Harden and Kyrie decimated their chances. During the offseason, Brooklyn tried to lock down the beard for the long term and ink him to an extension, but he ended up turning it down right before training camp. When asked about this, he dismissed the news, saying that Brooklyn was where he wanted to be, and that he was just totally focused on winning the championship this coming season. In reality, he most likely turned it down because he had the option to sign a better deal in the next offseason. This didn't really seem like a big deal, as the Nets were right up towards the top of the East, but things were clearly dysfunctional over there, especially with how the team handled Kyrie Irving not being allowed to play home games. For some reference, Kyrie didn't take the vaccine, which meant that he wasn't allowed to play in home games in New York City. As a result, the team told Kyrie he was banned from playing in away games as well. Despite that, they were still looking like a contender without their superstar guard, and actually allowed him to begin playing in road games during late December. But almost immediately after that, Kevin Durant went down with a knee injury. From there, Brooklyn completely fell apart as they dropped from 2nd all the way down to 8th in the East. As the losses began to pile up, Harden expressed his frustration with the lack of continuity surrounding his team, and it only got worse from there. On February 2nd, he had one of the worst games of his career, scoring only 4 points and displaying horrible energy throughout. It was eerily similar to his final games with the Rockets, which led to everybody concluding that he was checked out of Brooklyn mentally and would either walk in free agency or request a trade before the deadline. After that game, he was listed out with a hamstring injury, and even though the injury was in fact real, him being out of the lineup led the rumors flying around even more. For a brief moment, all of those rumors were shut down by head coach Steve Nash, who came out and specifically said that the Nets were not going to trade James Harden and that Brooklyn was where he wanted to be.
You guys are not trading James Harden.
Yes, that's
okay.
correct. But on the day of the deadline, Woj reported that Harden did in fact want to trade, but was afraid to formally request it due to the public backlash that he would get. While it wasn't confirmed, most people figured that this leak came from Harden's camp, as he was looking for the least destructive way possible to make it clear he wanted out. Ultimately, he got his exact wish for the second time in a row, as he was traded to the Sixers for Ben Simmons right before the 3 p.m. deadline on February 10th. And who was the GM that made all of this happen? Daryl Morey. The man who set James Harden up for success in Houston was now in Philly, and the two were determined at getting another crack at the title together. Coming into the 2023 season, all seemed to be well with Harden in Philadelphia. Not only was he fully bought into his new role as the full-time point guard, he also took a pay cut on a new 2-year deal that allowed the Sixers to round out their roster and bring in pieces like PJ Tucker, Daniel House, and Montrezl Harrell. The man who wouldn't take a pay cut to continue playing alongside 2 generational talents in OKC was now willing to take less money in order to get his team over the hump with confident role players. While it seemed like this was an incredibly selfless act, we've now found out that Harden and Daryl Morey had an under-the-table deal where the Sixers GM would give him a max extension after he opted out of his contract the next summer as a reward for sacrificing money this year. And throughout the season, there were 0 problems on the court. Embiid and Harden were one of the best duos in the NBA, as the big man won his first MVP award, in large part to Harden spoon-feeding him with great open looks, which led to him leading the league in assists. But around Christmas time, a very random report came out that said James Harden was interested in returning to Houston next season, and was considering signing with them over Philly in free agency. While this was puzzling due to the fact that the Beard demanded out from there just 2 years ago, they had a ton of cap space and would be able to give him a massive contract. If I had to guess, This was likely a leverage move from Harden's camp to try and drive up his value in the free agent market. It apparently had some legitimacy to it, but nobody truly expected him to leave a seemingly perfect situation in Philly to go back to a rebuilding Houston team at his age. Fast forward to the spring, and the Rockets brought in Ime Udoka to take over as the new head coach. And with that, he made it clear that he had no interest in bringing Harden back. Just like that, the Rockets were off the table, and everyone knew it. With no other teams having either the right fit or budget to sign Harden in free agency, there was pretty much no market for him besides Philly. Knowing this, the team presented potential contract extensions that were nowhere close to the years or dollars that Harden expected after taking less money for the team the year prior. Then we got a headline that seemed like it was an oxymoron. Right before free agency started, it was announced that James Harden was opting into the final year of his contract with the expectation that the Sixers would find a trade for him. Basically, the only way Harden was going to join another contender was if it was through a trade, because those teams didn't have the salary cap to add him for nothing. Surprisingly, James Harden didn't seem to know who he was dealing with. Daryl Morey infamously passed on plenty of strong offers for Ben Simmons after he requested a trade and actually brought him into training camp. When he showed that he had no interest in playing or helping the team, it was perceived that Philly had zero leverage in a potential trade. But Morey's stubbornness paid off, as James Harden pretty much fell into his lap to give Philly exactly what they wanted as a return. So after a few weeks of trying to get a heist return for Harden, the team shut down trade talks and told their disgruntled superstar that they wanted him to come into training camp. After the front office didn't hold up on their end of the bargain when he took less money, he opted in with the expectation that they would be able to find a trade for him. And when the team failed in doing that, they expected him to report to training camp like nothing ever happened. As a result, James publicly slandered his longtime friend during a press tour in China, saying,
Daryl Morey is a liar, and I will never be a part of an organization that he's a part of. Let me say that again. Daryl Morey is a liar, and I will never be a part of an organization that he's a part of again.
So with teams beginning training camp in a few weeks, we're still awaiting which side is going to give in first. Without any listed injury, if James Harden goes 30 straight days without reporting to work, his contract will be deemed incomplete. If that happens, he won't be able to sign with any team in any professional league without the Sixers giving him permission to do so. That being said, it's highly unlikely that Philly just allows him to go to another team after he didn't fulfill his contract with them. So either James Harden's going to eventually play for the Sixers this season, which would result in absolute chaos, or he'll risk not being able to play professional basketball ever again. And that's where we currently stand today. All of these situations are so unique and have such unlikely circumstances that it's hard to believe all of this drama has happened surrounding one player. Let me know in the comments which one of these trades was the craziest, predict how you think the situation in Philly will ultimately end, and I'll see you guys in the next video.